Everyone laughed when a Chinese billionaire mocked a black waiter in Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, but no one was laughing when the waiter finally replied, in flawless Mandarin. The chandeliers glowed like captured stars above the Jade Palace, Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, where power was measured not in money, but in the quiet way people leaned toward the woman at the head of the table. Liwi, the Chinese billionaire whose empire stretched across continents, reclined in her chair with the casual arrogance of someone who believed the room itself bowed to her presence. Around her sat 5 American businessmen, eager to impress, their laughter sharp and nervous as they tried to navigate both culture and opportunity. At their side, moving with the silent grace of someone practiced in invisibility, was David, a black waiter in a crisp uniform, balancing a bottle of wine with steady hands. Liwi's eyes followed him like a cat sizing up prey. Then, without lowering her voice, she pointed directly at him and spoke in flawless Mandarin, her tone dripping with contempt. "Look at that monkey serving us." For a second, the air did not move. The words slid across the polished table, bouncing off the crystal glasses, settling like poison in the air. The American businessmen glanced at one another, confused. They did not speak Mandarin, but they sensed the cruelty in her cadence. One of them forced a chuckle, then the others followed, their hollow laughter a desperate attempt to please a woman who controlled billions in contracts. The sound was wrong, too loud, too forced, like a laugh track echoing in a room where no one wanted to laugh. David kept his eyes on the wine glass he was filling, face carved into neutrality, as though the insult had passed through him without leaving a trace. But silence has its own gravity. A couple at the next table, who did speak Mandarin, froze mid-bite. The woman's lips parted slightly, the fork trembling in her hand. A young man at another table raised his phone, pretending to check a message, but his camera quietly faced the billionaire's table. Across the room, a waiter paused with a tray in midair, eyes flicking toward David before quickly looking away. Everyone heard something, even if they didn't know the words. Everyone felt it. Liwi leaned back, amused by her own cruelty, swirling the wine in her glass as if she had just made a clever joke. The businessmen laughed along, their eyes darting nervously at each other, afraid to be the first to break the rhythm. Power makes cowards of men who should know better, and here, in the golden light of the Jade Palace, power was laughing at a man whose only crime was carrying a bottle of wine. David placed the glass down carefully, his posture exact, his expression unreadable. He did not flinch. He did not break. He stood with the calmness of someone who had learned long ago that humiliation is often a game played by the insecure. Yet beneath that calm, a current ran strong, unseen but dangerous, like a river moving under ice. Around him, the room whispered with discomfort. The couple who understood Mandarin exchanged a glance heavy with outrage. The young man's phone, still recording, caught not only the billionaire's sneer, but also the way David's eyes remained steady, refusing to give her the satisfaction of reaction. It was in that silence that the first seed was planted, the seed of something neither Liwi nor her sycophants could imagine. Tonight they believed they were watching a powerless man endure the joke of someone untouchable. They could not see the storm forming quietly, invisibly, in the space between insult and reply. David poured the wine with the precision of a surgeon, the red liquid sliding into crystal without a single drop wasted. To the eyes at the table, he was nothing more than a shadow in uniform, another anonymous servant trained to vanish behind a smile. They did not see the weight in his shoulders or the discipline in his hands. They did not know that, beneath the quiet mask of a waiter, lived a man who once commanded rooms far larger and far more dangerous than this one. As the laughter rose again, hollow and forced, his mind traveled elsewhere. He remembered the oak-paneled conference halls of Beijing, where chandeliers hung not for beauty, but for symbolism, where every detail of posture and tone could shift the balance between nations. He remembered the feel of a pen in his hand, signing notes that would ripple through economies, remembered the nod of a Chinese ambassador across the table. The mutual respect earned only by those who spoke fluency, not just in language, but in culture. Once, not long ago, he had been Dr. David Thompson, Harvard Ph.D., cultural attaché to the American Embassy, the man who translated not only words but worlds. He had sat across from diplomats who represented 1 billion lives, and they had leaned forward to hear his counsel. His doctoral thesis on Sino-American protocol had been required reading at universities in 3 countries. Professors quoted him, students memorized his name. Now here he stood, pouring wine for men too nervous to even ask the meaning of the insults being thrown in a language they did not understand. The fall had been brutal, swift, and merciless. A whisper in the wrong ear, a document forged in malice, and suddenly the life he built had collapsed. He remembered the headlines, "American diplomat under FBI investigation." He remembered the weeks of humiliation, cameras outside his door, colleagues who once shook his hand now crossing the street to avoid him. He remembered sitting in a small windowless room while strangers asked him questions about loyalty, about secrets he never even had access to, about crimes he had not committed. The accusation had been espionage, a word that could strip a man of everything without leaving a mark of guilt. And though the case had dissolved, exposed as fabrication, the damage was irreversible. The academic institutions closed their doors. The State Department moved on, quietly erasing his name from the list of trusted experts. He had been cleared, yes. But clearance does not repair trust, and in his world, suspicion was a death sentence. So when no one else would take him, the Jade Palace had. A friend of a friend gave him the uniform and told him the pay was steady if he could learn to smile. It was supposed to be temporary. 8 months later, he was still carrying trays. He did it with dignity, because dignity was the one thing they had not stripped from him. Yet every night he wore this uniform. He felt the echo of who he had been pressing against the thin fabric, a ghost of the man who once spoke Mandarin with the ease of a native and could silence a room of ambassadors with a single carefully chosen phrase. They thought he was invisible. That was the cruelest irony of all. Liwi did not recognize him. She did not remember the conferences where she praised his insight, the polite emails where she called him the American who truly understood Chinese culture. To her now, he was just another nameless black man carrying plates in a city that had already judged him. He kept his face calm as he poured the next glass, but inside, the memory of his old life burned. He recalled the long hours in Harvard libraries, tracing the roots of Chinese philosophy, the endless drills of tone and dialect until his speech was flawless, indistinguishable from a native. He recalled being congratulated for bridging the gap between two superpowers. And he recalled the night the FBI came to his door and that bridge crumbled into dust. The men at the table did not see it. They saw only a waiter, but behind his silence was the memory of a man who had already endured storms fiercer than the laughter of cowards. What they thought was obedience was something else entirely. It was restraint. It was the dangerous patience of someone who knew that truth, when revealed at the right moment, could shatter every illusion built on arrogance. David lifted the wine bottle, stepped back from the table, and bowed his head in deference. They dismissed him with their eyes before turning back to Liwi's cruel amusement. None of them knew they were looking at a man who once shaped policy between nations. None of them knew that the waiter they ignored carried a past powerful enough to destroy the very woman mocking him. The evening dragged on under the heavy glow of chandeliers, and with every glass of wine poured, the cruelty at the center of the table thickened. Liwi, now loosened by champagne, leaned forward with the gleam of someone who had discovered a new form of entertainment. Her English, intentionally broken, turned sharp when directed at David. "You maybe only know how to clean toilet, yes," she said, waving her jeweled fingers as if dismissing an insect. The businessmen at the table shifted uneasily. They did not understand every word, but they understood enough. Their forced laughter came late, too brittle, bouncing against the marble walls before dying in the air. David bent slightly, serving appetizers with the same precise movements, his silence cutting deeper than any reply. Liwi was not satisfied. Switching back to Mandarin, she hissed, "That one probably has 3 children from 3 different fathers. That is how they live. Like animals breeding in ignorance." The words sliced through the air like glass shattering. The Americans at the table could not follow, but instinct told them something vicious had just been said. Robert Hayes, the most senior among them, cleared his throat and tried to interject with business talk. "Perhaps we should go over the contract details," he suggested. Liwi raised a hand without even looking at him. "No, let me finish," she said, switching between Mandarin and broken English as if she were conducting a cruel symphony. "You Americans think giving them jobs is progress. Look at him. He shakes just holding a tray." David's hand did tremble, but not from fear. Rage ran beneath his skin like current under ice, steady, contained, waiting. He set the dish down with deliberate calm, refusing to give her the satisfaction of reaction. The businessmen laughed nervously, caught between disgust and their fear of offending her. Liwi leaned back, savoring their discomfort as much as David's. "This is America, the land of fools," she continued in Mandarin, her eyes never leaving David. "They think money solves inferiority. Give a monkey a paycheck, he is still a monkey." Hayes pressed again, his voice strained. Liwi, perhaps we should. She cut him off sharply, her tone like a whip. Robert, please, this is important. They need to understand reality. Superiors and inferiors, that is the natural order. Her words in Mandarin were venom, but the mocking cadence was clear to anyone listening. Across the room, the couple who understood Mandarin lowered their eyes, shame written across their faces, though the insult was not directed at them. A young man's phone, still recording from a nearby table, caught her laughter, high, cruel, echoing off the crystal. The night continued like this, wave after wave of humiliation, each insult sharper than the last, each remark calculated to chip away at David's humanity. At one point she crooked her finger at him as if calling a dog. "You," she said in English, "come closer. What is your name?" "David, ma'am." She rolled the name on her tongue as if it was something unpleasant. "David, have you ever heard of China? Do you know where it is on a map?" Her laugh rose again, shrill and childish. "How cute. He knows where China is." In Mandarin she added, "I would bet my fortune this monkey has never left New York in his life." Guests laughed again, thin and uneasy. David's eyes flicked up, just for a second, meeting hers with a calmness that unsettled her more than open defiance could have. He lowered his gaze and returned to his work, but something in the silence made even the Americans straighten in their chairs. The cruelty escalated. With every sip of wine, Liwi grew bolder, her words sharper, her performance grander. She began to imitate accents, mocking African-American speech in grotesque tones, then laughing at her own mimicry. The Americans shifted uncomfortably, but none dared stop her. Power, after all, was measured in contracts, and she held billions. And then, as if cruelty itself were not enough, she reached for her phone. The diamonds on her fingers glinted as she lifted it, switching the camera on. Her smile widened with the confidence of someone who believed no one could touch her. Speaking in Mandarin, she recorded, "I am here in Manhattan, at the most expensive restaurant, showing how Americans train their black servants. Watch. This is how you tame a black servant in America." The words were poison, clear and deliberate, every syllable soaked in arrogance. She turned the camera toward David, who continued to clear the table, his movements as calm as ever. What she did not see was the young man 2 tables away capturing the entire scene. What she did not realize was that David himself catalogued every word, every gesture, filing them away in a patience honed by months of humiliation. The businessmen looked away, shame coloring their faces, but still they said nothing. Hayes pressed a napkin to his forehead, pale with discomfort, but he too remained silent. Liwi lowered her phone, satisfied with her performance, and placed it beside her champagne glass. She laughed again, a sound brittle with cruelty. "See, even Americans laugh when you show them the truth," she said in broken English. But no one was laughing anymore. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. A silence that belonged not to a room at dinner, but to a courtroom waiting for judgment. David bowed his head and stepped back, his expression unreadable. Only his eyes betrayed something else, a flicker, brief but undeniable, of cold determination. What the billionaire did not know was that every cruel second she had documented had already become something else entirely. She believed she had captured proof of superiority. In truth, she had just filmed the evidence of her own destruction. Noise of the dining room faded the moment David pushed through the swinging door into the staff corridor. The laughter, the brittle clinking of glasses, the sharp syllables of Mandarin, all dissolved into a muted hum behind the thick walls. He stepped into the employee bathroom, locked the door, and for the first time that night allowed himself to breathe. The mirror reflected a man who looked older than his years, the crisp uniform doing little to disguise the fatigue etched into his face. He leaned forward, hands gripping the sink, the words still ringing in his ears. Sin V letter 1 EADT H letter 1 EA1 D stroke letter 1 EB3 and G, an inferior creature. That was the insult that broke the pattern. 8 months of swallowing humiliation, of lowering his head, of pretending not to hear. Tonight it had crossed a line. David reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and scrolled through his contacts until his thumb hovered over a name he had not called in over a year. Dr. James Chun, mentor, friend, the man who had once told him, "You were born for diplomacy, David. You see what others are blind to." His hands shook, not from fear but from the adrenaline of a decision made. He typed quickly, every word a release of months of silence. "James, I need a favor. I am at the Jade Palace in Manhattan. Liwi of Y Industries is here making extreme racist remarks in Mandarin, assuming no one understands. I have recordings. Can we meet tomorrow?" He hesitated, then hit send. The message left his screen, and for a moment the world held its breath. David stared at his reflection, the quiet resolve in his eyes burning stronger than the weariness in his body. Less than 2 minutes later, the phone vibrated. He looked down. The reply was short, urgent, almost breathless. "My God, David, where have you been all this time?" "Yes, this is explosive. Liwi is already under internal investigation for corruption. Meet me tomorrow." David closed his eyes and let the words sink in. Explosive. The very word carried the weight of possibility, of consequence, of the storm he had silently been preparing. He had walked into this night expecting another round of humiliation. Instead, he had walked into the moment that could redefine everything. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, straightened his posture, and smoothed the front of his jacket. The mask of the waiter returned, but behind it was something sharper. He thought of the countless times he had endured insults, every casual slur catalogued and filed away in memory. Tonight, those insults were no longer shackles, they were ammunition. David lingered a moment longer in the quiet room, the mirror reflecting a man who was no longer hiding but preparing. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "Enough." Then he turned, unlocked the door, and walked back down the corridor. With each step, the hum of laughter grew louder, the glow of chandeliers nearer. To the people at the table, he would still be just the waiter carrying plates. But inside, he carried something far more dangerous, the calm determination of a man armed with truth, with patience, and with the certainty that arrogance always carries the seed of its own destruction. Tonight, for the first time in months, David was not just surviving, he was preparing to strike. Chandeliers still blazed over the Jade Palace, but by now the glow felt harsh, unforgiving, like a spotlight on cruelty. Liwi, drunk with both wine and her own power, leaned forward, her voice pitched high with mockery. "You waiter," she said in halting English, pointing at David with the tip of her jeweled finger, "you know how to dance like a monkey? Come, show us funny show." The businessmen froze, their laughter long dead. Hayes dropped his gaze, wishing he were anywhere else. But no one moved, no one spoke. The silence around the table was suffocating. David stood with a tray in his hands, the weight suddenly irrelevant. He set it down carefully on the sideboard, then straightened his shoulders. For the first time that night, he raised his eyes and looked directly at Liwi, not with fear, not with submission, with a calmness so profound it was dangerous. The corners of his mouth lifted into the faintest smile. And then, in Mandarin so precise it struck like lightning, he said, "Madam, this is not a zoo, and I am not your monkey." The words sliced the air clean, sharper than any blade. The room went still. The chandeliers seemed to flicker, as though even the light had been caught off guard. Liwi's painted smile collapsed, her face draining of color. The businessmen stared, mouths half open, eyes wide. They did not understand Mandarin, but Robert Hayes did. Years of working with interpreters had tuned his ear, and he recognized at once not only the fluency but the authority behind the words. This was not the speech of a man who had picked up phrases from the street. This was the language of a scholar, a diplomat, a master. "What did you say?" Liwi stammered in English, the arrogance evaporating from her voice. David did not look away. In the same flawless Mandarin, calm and unhurried, he repeated, "I said this is not a zoo, and I am not your monkey." His tone was measured, elegant, the kind of Mandarin that carried echoes of university lecture halls and diplomatic chambers. He might as well have struck her across the face. A murmur ran through the room as nearby diners turned in their seats, sensing that something irreversible had just happened. The silence that followed was heavy, electric. The businessmen shifted, their nervousness transforming into shock, then into something closer to awe. Hayes leaned forward, whispering, "My God." He had read articles by Dr. David Thompson. He had heard the name whispered in business circles as the man who once explained China to America better than any other. And now he realized the waiter before him was no ordinary servant, but that very man. Liwi tried to recover, her voice trembling. You speak Chinese?" The question sounded foolish even as it left her lips. David's expression remained calm, unyielding. "Yes, classical Mandarin, modern Mandarin, Cantonese, and 3 regional dialects. Also English, French, and some Japanese. But I suppose you already know that." His words hung in the air, layered with quiet devastation. He had just undone 90 minutes of her mockery with a single revelation. Every insult, every slur, every cruel theory about inferiority now lay exposed, proof of her ignorance rather than his. The color drained further from her face as the realization dawned. For over an hour she had been speaking poison into the ears of a man who understood every syllable, cataloging each word with the precision of a recorder. David took one step closer, his voice still calm but edged with steel. "You confuse money with education, birth with character, and social status with human value. That is your mistake." The words were not shouted. They did not need to be. The calmness carried more weight than rage ever could. Around the table, the businessmen sat in stunned silence, forced to confront their own cowardice in letting the humiliation go on unchecked. Hayes gripped the edge of the table, his mind racing. The name, the voice, the authority, it all fit. The waiter was not a waiter. He was Dr. David Thompson, the scholar who had disappeared from Washington a year earlier under a cloud of rumors. Hayes whispered it aloud without meaning to. David Thompson. Liwi flinched as though struck. Her hands trembled. A glass rattling against the table. No, that's impossible. You're just a black waiter. The words sounded hollow even to her. David inclined his head slightly. Yes, I am a waiter, but I am also Dr. David Thompson, Harvard PhD in Asian Studies, former cultural attaché to the United States Embassy in Beijing, and the man who once helped shape trade policy between our nations. His gaze did not waver, and I have listened, in perfect comprehension, to every word you spoke tonight. The businessmen exhaled sharply, the weight of the revelations sinking in. The balance of power at the table had shifted completely. Liwi's empire of arrogance, built on the assumption of ignorance, crumbled in an instant. David's smile did not widen, but his calmness radiated through the room like a storm contained within a glass. In that silence, justice had begun to speak, and for the first time all evening, the room truly listened. The table that only minutes before had been filled with brittle laughter now sat in stunned silence. The Americans no longer forced smiles. Their eyes were wide, darting between the billionaire who had just been unmasked and the man they had mistaken for a servant. The air was thick, the kind of silence that comes when power shifts and everyone realizes they are standing on the wrong side. Liwi's lips trembled as she tried to summon her composure. "This is ridiculous," she spat in English, her voice unsteady. "You're lying. You can't be who you say you are." David's expression did not change. He spoke evenly, each word deliberate, his Mandarin crisp, his English sharper still. "I was at Harvard when you were still inheriting your father's empire. I earned my doctorate in Asian studies. I published 17 academic articles on Chinese diplomatic protocol. For 5 years, I worked as cultural attaché at the United States Embassy in Beijing. And for 3 of those years, I coordinated delegations with your company, Y Industries." Her face twisted, the name of her own empire thrown back at her like evidence in court. David leaned in slightly, his voice lowering but cutting deeper. "You praised me in writing, madam. You once called me the American who truly understood your culture. Have you forgotten so quickly?" Liwi's hand shot forward, grabbing her phone, as if clinging to the last weapon she had. "I'll sue you," she hissed. "I'll destroy you. I have power. I have lawyers. I will end you." David's calm was absolute. He reached into his pocket and retrieved his own phone, unlocking the screen with a swipe. On it was a message glowing under the chandeliers. He turned it for her to see. The words were simple, devastating. "David, this is explosive. The Chinese consulate must see this immediately. James Chun." David's eyes met hers, steady and merciless. "Every word you spoke tonight was recorded. Every insult, every theory of superiority, every humiliation, even the video you proudly made of yourself." He paused, his voice dropping into silence before the final strike. Does dignity depend on Harvard or on being human? The question hung over the table like a gavel about to fall. The Americans shifted in their seats, no longer nervous, no longer pretending. Robert Hayes stood abruptly, his chair scraping the marble floor. "My God," he said, his voice carrying the weight of realization, "you humiliated one of the foremost experts on your own culture." Around the room, whispers spread like fire. Diners craned their necks, eyes fixed on the table where the mighty had just been dragged into the dust. The manager of the Jade Palace, who had been hovering at a distance, hurried forward. His face, once indifferent, now glowed with respect. "Mr. Thompson," he said firmly, bowing his head, "I did not know your background. From this moment, our policy will change." Liwi's eyes widened, her last defense slipping away. The name reverberated in her ears. "Mr. Thompson, not waiter, not servant, not monkey." She shook her head in disbelief, her words faltering. No, this can't," but it could, and it had. Her empire of arrogance had been built on the assumption of ignorance, and in one moment it crumbled into ruin. The power she thought she wielded had flipped, the room itself no longer hers. For the first time all evening, David did not bow, did not retreat, did not shrink into the shadows. He stood, tall and calm, the weight of dignity radiating from him. Around him, the atmosphere was no longer one of mockery, but of reckoning. And in the trembling silence of that grand dining hall, Liwi Aries realized she had not just lost control of a dinner. She had destroyed her own legacy with the arrogance of her own tongue. 3 months later, the headlines told a story that no one could have predicted the night at Jade Palace. The Wall Street Journal carried it first. Why Industries loses $800 million in contracts after racist videos surface. Within days, Bloomberg, CNN, and the BBC followed. The videos recorded at the restaurant spread across continents, subtitled into 10 languages, replayed on talk shows, dissected in universities. The footage of a billionaire laughing while calling a black waiter a monkey was shocking enough. The revelation that the so-called waiter was Dr. David Thompson, Harvard PhD and former cultural attaché, turned it into a global reckoning. In Shanghai, Liwi woke up each morning to the kind of silence she had once inflicted on others. No invitations, no meetings, no contracts. Her own family called her into a video conference and delivered the sentence with cold efficiency. The board has decided you need time to reflect. Your executive privileges are suspended indefinitely. The screen went dark, leaving her alone in a penthouse that suddenly felt like a cell. Once courted by governments, she now found doors slammed shut in every capital. She became a pariah, her name whispered only as a warning of arrogance's cost. Meanwhile, David's world opened wider than ever before. The viral video transformed him into a symbol of dignity in the face of prejudice. Invitations flooded his inbox. Universities in Europe, Asia, and America asked him to speak on culture, resilience, and human rights. The State Department, once so quick to discard him, reached out with an offer not only to restore his old position, but to promote him. He accepted. With one condition: 1 day a week he would still walk through the doors of Jade Palace, but not in a uniform. He returned as an advisor and minority partner, determined to ensure no one in that restaurant would ever again feel the sting of humiliation he had endured. Jade Palace itself became a landmark. Tourists from around the world came not just for the food, but to see the place where a man stripped of status had reminded the world what dignity meant. Journalists called it a sanctuary, activists a symbol, diners a pilgrimage. The staff who once thought of David as invisible now spoke his name with respect. On a stage at an international summit, cameras flashing, David gave the speech that sealed his legacy. His voice was steady, carrying the same calm that had silenced a billionaire. Money can buy silence, contracts, even governments, but it will never buy dignity. The words echoed across the hall, clipped and replayed on every major network, printed on placards at protests, quoted in boardrooms where executives reconsidered their policies. It was no longer just his story. It was a banner for anyone who had ever been told they were less. In Shanghai, Liwi watched that speech alone on her phone, the glow of the screen harsh in the darkness of her apartment. She pressed pause halfway through, unable to bear the contrast between the man standing on the world stage and the memory of the night she believed she had destroyed him. Once she had mocked him as invisible. Now she lived unseen, a footnote to his story, erased by her own arrogance. The irony was complete. The man she had called a monkey had become the voice of human dignity. The woman who thought herself untouchable was now forgotten, her empire cracked, her name a cautionary tale. Justice had taken its time, but when it came, it left a legacy no one could ignore. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.